C'est l'épicentre de notre vie. Alors je vous le dis très solennellement ce soir, cette cathédrale, nous la rebâtirons. Et c'est sans doute une part du destin français, parce que c'est ce que notre histoire mérite. Parce que c'est notre destin profond.
There had always been, since the early Middle Ages, a number of churches on the Île de la Cité, the kind of center of Paris, as most people think of it. And Notre-Dame really only came into being later in the 12th century.
This is Dr. Matthew Gabriel, co-author of The Bright Ages.
It was interestingly kind of part of an architectural arms race. The Abbey Church of Saint-Denis had just been completed in about 1140. And that was kind of the first instance of what we now call Gothic architecture. And the bishop wanted to kind of recenter power back in the city of Paris.
And one way to do this? A big old church. It took almost 200 years to build, but when finished, Notre-Dame towered over the city, adorned with 3 rose windows, dozens of statues, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses. The building quickly became a staple in Parisian life.
We tend to think cathedrals exist as only a religious space, and that's not really the case. They were part of everyday life there. This is where you went to meet up with people, but it was also kind of where business was conducted.
But for these iconic structures, overcoming centuries of historical challenges proved difficult, at least for most.
Notre-Dame is a little bit of an odd duck. It didn't endure the same types of challenges that a lot of other churches.
There were, however, several close calls, like these 3 moments in history.
Early in the Reformation was what we call iconoclasm, in which statuary, stained glass, basically any kind of images that had been part of church teaching, those were destroyed. But because France remained predominantly a Catholic country at the time, and Paris specifically didn't suffer hostile takeover, Notre Dame itself didn't suffer in that particular way.
During the French Revolution, Notre Dame was seen as a symbol of the monarchy, and therefore ransacked and used for food storage. Even statues weren't spared an all-too-common fate. Notre Dame's 28 statues of the biblical kings were pulled from their facade and decapitated. But for a lucky 21, their heads were later found in 1977.
Adolf Hitler's mechanized forces are racing toward Paris as French resistance collapses.
During World War II, there wasn't this sustained shelling of the city because of Paris's kind of iconic structure. Both the Nazis and the Americans kind of avoided that.
But nearing the end of the war, another close call developed. In desperation, Hitler demanded that Paris must not pass into the enemy's hands except as a field of ruins. But the order was not carried out, and Paris was liberated.
Paris is free. 4 years of courage and hope have been answered, and a flood tide of jubilation has burst forth.
There was always those kind of moments of threat, and I think that's true really of any kind of building or construction that survives for millennia. They're subject to historical circumstance.
And for Notre Dame's circumstances, it was actually indifference that proved to be one of its greatest challenges.
Especially in the late 18th and 19th century, it really wasn't a terribly important site.
Napoleon's coronation provided a brief spotlight, but the allure of the cathedral had no doubt faded. That is, until a surprising hero arrived.
Around the time of 1830, Victor Hugo published a novel, which we think of as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, but it was actually called Notre-Dame de Paris. It's just named after the building.
Sorry, Quasimodo.
And that sparked kind of a worldwide interest in the building. See the place where Victor Hugo's novel had been set.
With new interests came new plans for restorations.
This French historian, Viollet Leduc, undertook the renovations to restore the building to kind of what he thought it would be. And he had a particular vision of what the Middle Ages should have been rather than what they were. He really liked a certain type of later Gothic architecture, which wasn't common at the time that Notre-Dame was built.
So,
he added a spire because he thought there should have been a spire.
a piece we now see as an iconic part of the cathedral, but at the time, might not have gone over so well.
The changes that he made, I think, were indeed oftentimes controversial because with Notre-Dame, you had been living with that building for generations. It looked a certain way, and then you put a spire on top of it. It looks really different. You've changed the scope of the building, and so people don't like that oftentimes when you mess with something that's an iconic structure.
Regardless of the reaction, Viollet-le-Duc's restorations left the version of Notre-Dame we know today. Until another pivotal moment in the cathedral's history.
Les prochaines heures seront difficiles.
But Notre-Dame was once again escaping more tragic fate.
Le pire a été évité, même si la bataille n'est pas encore totalement gagnée.
The intricate oak roof framework, known as the forest, was destroyed. But the stone exterior escaped much of the damage, leaving the rose windows and both bell towers still standing. Viollet-le-Duc's 19th century spire was lost, but by pure chance, the statues housed inside it had been removed for restorations just days earlier. Notre-Dame survived, but was changed forever.
To me, as a historian, maybe ironically, I think buildings change because they're living parts of people's experience. And they can't stay stuck in the past. It's amazing, again, that Notre-Dame survived as long as it did. These things change, and they will continue to change. We should acknowledge there was a catastrophic monumental fire in early 2019. There was a before, and now there's an after, and that's okay.
Like the fate of many structures before it, what appears lost will be rebuilt, providing the opportunity for future connections with Notre-Dame.
I remember visiting there for the first time and feeling the stone because it looks smooth, but it's not. And it reminds you this was handmade. There were people who did this. That's the way that buildings can connect us to the past. And Notre-Dame is just a really phenomenal example of that.